dismissed at this time. Hey, let's thank our worship team for leading us this morning. Now, I don't know if you know this or not. I'm sure most of you know. In fact, I'm gonna go ahead and guess that all of you know. But does anybody know who was in Chicago this past weekend? No? All right, Beyonce. Beyonce was here this past weekend, and she had 2 sold-out shows at Soldier Field, packed the entire stadium. And people were going nuts about this. People were going crazy about this. But let me just say really quickly, Beyonce could not sing a better song than what we're singing here together as a church family this morning. You know, we sing the glory and the praise of Jesus Christ, a song that is being sung in heaven 24/7. It never stops because Jesus is never ceasing of deserving of our glory and praise. And so our worship team was practicing this morning, and we were kind of sitting back and we were meeting in the kitchen, and all I could tell them is, I can't wait to sing these songs with our church family together. And so I'm just so thankful for them. I'm so thankful for you that you're a church that's willing to lift up your voice and to sing. I know singing can be awkward for a lot of people, you know, especially if you don't know how to do it, okay? You know, God gifted some people with miraculous, amazing voices, and He gifted most of us with supportive voices. You know, we sing with everybody else. But I just want to encourage you this morning that Jesus is never ceasing of your praise and worship. He deserves your everything. He deserves our everything. And so we're just so thankful for that. Hey, church family, I'm so thankful that Garrett filled in for me last week. I was thankful for the break. I was thankful to see God move through him, and that won't be the last time you see him. And so I was wondering if you could just join me in thanking Garrett for leading us last. And I was joking with him because before we even looked at Genesis, I don't know if you know this, but we're now like 20-something weeks into Genesis. And before we even started Genesis, Garrett came up to me. He's like, hey, I want to preach on Abraham sacrificing Isaac. And I was like, come on, man. That's like the golden passage of Genesis. Like, you're going to take the best one. And I joked with him. I was like, we'll see how it works out. Well, I knew I was going to be out of town on May 22nd, and sure enough, I'm planning out the sermon series, and here comes May 22nd, the Sunday that Garrett's going to preach, and guess what it is? It's Abraham sacrificing Isaac. And so I just said, praise you, Lord. You know what you're doing. You're sovereign in all things, and you answer the prayer of a righteous man, and Garrett was praying for that sermon, and more importantly, he was praying that it would touch your heart and move in your life, and I pray it did. Community groups were booming. The questions were coming. That was an important passage. And we come now following that into Genesis chapter 23, and I have to be honest, it almost seems like we've had difficult passage after difficult passage after difficult passage. And one of the things that we said is when we go through books of the Bible like this, you can't pass up these difficult things that God does not pass up. You can't sugarcoat the painful, difficult things that God puts in His Word. And so we come to Genesis chapter 23, and it's another difficult passage, not necessarily difficult to understand, but a painful and difficult reality in our life. You see, this morning in Genesis 23, we're going to be looking at the death of Sarah, Abraham's wife. This is, in fact, it's the very first funeral that we have in the book of Genesis, not the first death, but the first funeral. And I have to be honest, as I was preparing this sermon for Genesis 23, in a lot of ways, I've preached more funerals than I wanted to in my life. And I almost felt as if I was preparing a eulogy, a funeral sermon here. But here's the reality. God not only speaks into our life, but He also speaks into our death. And so God's Word covers every single area of our life, including the most painful and difficult ones. I imagine it's not a stretch to say that all of us in some way, shape, or form have experienced the painful reality of death in our life, in our family's lives, in our friends' lives. And so God has something tremendously important to teach us through this difficult topic, and personally through difficult seasons when the season of death comes into your family and into your life. And so let's just pray before we dig into this passage. Father, thank you for your word. God, that even in the valleys, even in the difficult seasons of our life, God, you rest us assured that you're with us. God, that when we experience the most painful thing, the death of a loved one, the death of a family member, the death of a friend, God, even our own death, that we don't have to fear, we don't have to wonder, God, but you've spoken through your word into these painful areas. And so as we look to your passage, as we look to Genesis 23, God, and we put ourselves in Abraham's position, where Abraham has now lost his wife, God, I pray that you would speak to us. We need your word, and we need a word from you. So we're asking this in the powerful name of Jesus, the Word. We pray this. Amen. Amen. Let's just begin Genesis 23. The very first thing God points us to in Genesis 23 is he looks at Sarah's life. Look at verse 1. The Bible tells us that Sarah lived 127 years, and these were the years of the life of Sarah. So just like that, in a single verse, Moses, the author of the book of Genesis, writes in summation of the life of a woman who lived 127 years. Now, I want you to think about that for a moment. How do you sum up into a single sentence? How do you summarize a woman's life who lived 127 years? How do you say all that there is to say about somebody who lived that long and lived the kind of life Sarah did? I mean, think about that for a moment. You remember the things we've talked about from Sarah's life? I mean, what would Sarah be known for? Well, I'm going to give you a couple of things, if maybe to refresh your memory. I think the very first thing that we notice about this, and the very first thing that we'll remember about Sarah, is the fact that Sarah lived 127 years. Did you know in the Bible that there's no other woman that it is recorded how long she lived or what her age was? Did you know that? Only Sarah do we know how old she was when she died. Do you know why that's true? Why I think that's true? I think it's true because I believe that Moses is the only man to survive with that kind of information. You missed it. Ladies, is your age something that you like to post out there? No, you guys are more secretive than the CIA when it comes to your age, right? And when somebody guesses that your age is younger than what you are, then usually you praise that person, you're thankful. But if somebody guesses your exact age or older, maybe even a day older, they go missing, right? And so I think Moses was probably the only man to survive with that kind of information, but the details in the Bible matter. And what I mean by that is the fact that Moses thought it important enough to give us how old Sarah was showing us that Sarah's life is something worthy of honor. That Moses is wanting us to regard and to respect this woman. She's a very important person, not just in the Bible, but through all of her life. Well, why? Because, the second thing I think we'll remember Sarah not only for how long her life was, but also that she was a woman of faith. Sarah was a woman of faith. She believed God. Or I guess if we used our vernacular, Sarah was a Christian. She was a believer. She believed God. She trusted God. She believed in His promise. 3 times in the Bible, we are told to look to Sarah as an example of faith and obedience. 3 times. Once in Isaiah chapter 51, verse 1 and 2, Hebrews 11:11, and 1 Peter 3:3-6 tells us to look to her as an example of faith and obedience. Now, let me ask you, was Sarah perfect? No, not by any means. But she was a woman of faith and obedience. See, that's what it means to be a believer in God. That's what it means to be a Christian. It means to be somebody, not that you're perfect, but that you live your life in faith of God and you live your life in active obedience to His Word. Sarah was an example of that. It didn't mean she didn't struggle to believe. It didn't mean she didn't have her doubts at times. but it means that she was a woman of faith. I think we'll also remember the fact that she was 90 years old when she had her first child. Is that anybody else's story? Anybody else got that trophy, right? Anybody making plans at 90? Like, hey, you know, honey, we've settled down now at 90. I think it's time to start a family, right? Anybody got that plan? No, you like hope to make it to 90, right? And so Sarah had her first child at 90 years old. Can we agree that takes some faith? Let me make it a little bit more. They didn't have epidurals back then. They didn't have hospitals back then. They didn't have midwives back then. This took some faith. How about the fact that she's been married to one man for over 100 years? I mean, can anybody else say that? Would anybody else want that? Ladies, here's your chance to answer some honest questions, right? Would you want that? She demonstrated a lifelong commitment to her husband. You know, I think every married couple in this room has moments where they have, if we're honest, where it's like, man, I don't know if I could do this anymore. And I'm sure Sarah maybe had some moments like that. I could think of two. But the reality is she knew that marriage was a covenant, that marriage was a commitment between her and her husband, and she was ride or die. I mean, it was a lifelong commitment for Sarah to stay with her husband. I mean, think about that. She followed God's call on her husband's life. You think back in Genesis 12 when God called Abraham out of Ur. God said, Abraham, I want you to leave this place. I want you to leave this wicked city. I want you to go to a place that I will tell you in faith. I'm not telling you where it's at yet, but I want you to go in faith. I want you to trust me. I'm going to give you a son, and I'm going to give you a home, and I'm going to be with you. I'm going to be your God, and I'm going to be the God of your children and your descendants, and I want you to go. Now, at that point, Sarah could have looked at her husband and said, bye. God called you. But she followed her husband's call. She left her hometown. She left everything she knew. Why? Because God called her to be faithful, to be obedient. She stuck with her husband through being given away twice to pagan men. She stuck with her husband through infertility and the pain of childbirth. She stuck with her husband through almost sacrificing his son. Now, there's some debate about that. That obviously maybe caused some issues. So when we think about Sarah's life, which Genesis 23 points us to, when we think about the life of this woman, I think we could sum up her life in this statement. Sarah lived her life through faith in God and often through failure. Sarah lived her life through faith in God and often through failure. And so Genesis 23, it throws out this woman's life for us, and I think what it's doing is it's acting as a mirror to ask us, what do you want to be remembered for? Now, Sarah lived for 127 years. She'll be remembered forever for being a woman of faith and obedience to God, even though she went through a lot of failure, a lot of struggle, a lot of hardship. But even through all of that, she'll be known for her faith in God. And the question that's confronting us just from the very first verse is, what do you want to be remembered for? When you think about your life and at the end of your life, what do you want people to remember you for? Now, I think a lot of us have maybe our pat answers of like, I want to be remembered for being, courageous or a hard worker or a great parent or... Let me ask you then, what are you doing right now to make that a reality then? Like if you want to be remembered for being a faithful believer in Jesus Christ, if you want to be remembered for being courageous, then what are you doing right now to demonstrate that faith? What are you doing right now to demonstrate that courage? you're gathering with your church family, that's a pretty good start. Looking to His Word, that's a pretty good start. But what do you want to be remembered for? And what are you doing now to make that a reality? You see, Sarah lived her life in faith. And her life of 127 years, you'll think of how many stories she has, stories of just crazy things God did, stories of disappointment, stories of joy, stories of sorrow. Now, after 127 years, it abruptly comes to an end, because then we read in verse 2, and Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. All right, so we're told that she lived 127 years, and then abruptly we're told that she died. Now, we're not told how she died, the manner of which she died. We don't know if it was just simply old age. Can we agree 127? That's pretty. It's getting up there, at least, okay? Nobody's running a marathon at 127, so we don't know if it's old age, maybe a camel accident, maybe something happened. We don't know. We don't know the manner in which she died. But here's what we do know. We're told some very important information. Where did she die? Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of what? Canaan. And we're not told how she died, but we're told where she died. And she died in the land of Canaan. Now, why is that important? Okay, God called Abraham and Sarah to go to Canaan. It would be a promised land He had not given to them. Okay, so the gift is sitting there. They're looking at it, but God had not yet given it to them. And she died in Canaan. She died waiting on the promises of God. She died believing that God would fulfill His promise to her. She died in faith. This is a grave reminder to us. She died, listen to this, she died waiting on God to fulfill His promise. So I think as we look at this passage, we need to think about the fact that one day we too will, like Sarah, will die. And I know it sounds pretty morbid, but the reality is that no one in this room, none of us are exempt from death. See, no matter how hard you fight death, no matter how many vegetables you eat, no matter how much you work out, no matter what you do, eventually the reality is that every single one of us in this room will be gone. I think sometimes, too, we foolishly think, I know, especially myself, when I was younger, I thought, well, I'm going to die when I'm old. And then I lost friends. 26 years old. My friend Matt, gone. 28. My friend Mike, gone. And so the reality is that death is going to come to all of us, and we need to face that reality. I mean, Hebrews 9:27 tells us that there is a time, a place, and a way that our death is appointed. That, doctors can guess, we can kind of prepare, but the reality is only God knows when that time will come. And we have to face that reality. We can't ignore that reality. I find it hilarious, not hilarious, I find it ironic that we live in a culture that can talk about sex openly, crassly. I mean, you can meet a stranger and talk about it, and it's accepted in our culture, but you bring up the topic of death, and it becomes immediately uncomfortable. Our culture tries to hide it. We don't like to face it, but the reality is, and the Bible teaches us, the reality is we need to face the reality that one day we will die. I think the second thing this makes us consider is not only the fact that we are going to die, but we need to consider how we want to die. I don't mean the manner of which we will die. Faith and I decided already, like, if we go, we got to go together. Because if I get left with those kids by myself, it's going to be bad. I just don't know how it's going to turn out. I mean, I'm going to need you, church family. And so, like, you could try to plan, but the reality is we don't determine that. And so the question I think Sarah is leaving us with is, will I be like Sarah and die in faith, or will I die in unbelief? See, Sarah died trusting God, and we have to ask, well, when my time comes, will God find me trusting in Him? Waiting on His promises? Hoping that He will see my faith? Knowing that He'll see my faith? Why is that important that we think about these things? Well, the reality is the death of man is nothing unique. You know, we've been in Genesis for quite a while now, and so far we've been introduced to at least 131 people by name or by reference. Okay, I know because I counted. So far in our study, we've been introduced to at least 131 people. And there's something in common about all of these people, no matter how different they are. Okay, think how different Lamech is from Enoch, or Noah and Shem. No matter how different these people are, do you know that there's one thing in common between all the 131 people? They're all dead, or they're going to be. And so the death of man is nothing unique. It happens all the time. But I can tell you this. I can tell you this from Genesis, and I can tell you this from experience, that the death of a believer, somebody who dies in faith, is a very unique thing. Somebody who dies in faith in Jesus Christ is a very unique thing. Because for the believer in Jesus Christ, death is simply the car ride to the greatest place with the greatest people in the presence of the one true God. Which is why Christians are commanded over and over in the Bible not to fear death, but to fear God. And so when we look to Sarah's life, when we see that she lived her life in faith in God, and we see this almost courageous kind of death, that she was going to be okay, we're left to consider our own life and our own death. And will we die in faith in Jesus Christ or in unbelief? For Sarah, she's in the presence of God. But we know for those who are left behind, this is a difficult and painful process. So we see this in the text next. Moses points not only to Sarah's life and death, but now to Sarah's husband, Abraham. Verse 2, and Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. So Abraham, her husband, he goes into the room. He goes next to her bedside. And the very first thing he does is he mourns. Now, I imagine there are very few things in this life that are more painful than this reality right here. We have to get this picture in our head because verse 2 doesn't really paint it for us, but we have to get this image in our head that Abraham is now sitting at the bedside of his dead wife, who he's been married to for over 100 years. This is his bride. This is his baby. His heart is now broken. He'll no longer be able to sit with her. He'll no longer be able to talk to her. He'll no longer be able to hold her hand. He'll no longer be able to watch the sunset again with his wife. Abraham begins to weep. His eyes are full of tears. And we don't know, because the scriptures don't tell us, we don't know if the tears that Abraham cries are tears of just simply tears of sorrow over losing his wife, or maybe tears of regret. You see, Abraham has done some things in his marriage that would probably cause him to have some regret. We don't know if Abraham is sitting there crying and saying to himself, man, I wish I would have treated her better. I wish I would have not given her away those 2 times. I wish I would have never done what I did with Hagar. I wish I would have told her I loved her more. I wish I would have told her she was beautiful more. Why did I get so angry so easily with her? Why did I take her for granted? Why didn't I take her to that place she always wanted to go in Canaan? The place she kept asking Why didn't I wake up earlier to spend more time with her? Why didn't I stay up later to make sure she was okay? You have to think about this, because I imagine that all of us who are married in this room, if we lost our spouse today, there may be some things in our marriage, there may be some things in our life that if we lost them, we would have some tears of regret. I know there's some of you in this room that are single. You're not married yet, but statistically, 93% of you will get married. And what we need to get in our minds is this image of an old man sitting at the deathbed of his wife, crying, weeping. See, the reality is marriage is difficult. Marriage is painful. And I think so much time in our marriages are wasted on bitterness, intentional and hurtful words, missed opportunities, and if we're honest, petty arguments. See, I haven't lost my wife, but even just the thought of that is so painful. So the question I think this faces us is there something in your marriage that if you lost your wife or if you lost your husband today, it would cause tears of regret along with tears of sorrow? Ladies, look at your husband and say, uh-huh. Speak up, buddy. Abraham doesn't remain in his mourning, though. We read in verse 3, Abraham rose up from before his dead. So we get this picture that Abraham has now spent time mourning and weeping over his wife. I think that's so comforting, because a lot of times I think people tell you, man, just move on, just get over it. But God allows us to mourn. But he teaches us that we can't stay in our mourning. If we're not careful, we could get stuck in our grief and in our sorrow. Abraham could have begun to doubt God and his goodness. But because Abraham is a man of faith, right, he knows that death is not the end. 1 Thessalonians 4:13 tells us this. It says, but we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, those who have passed away. I love that. God doesn't call believers dead. He just says, hey, they're asleep for a while. He says that you may not grieve as others who do not have hope. In other words, listen, death does not cripple us. Because we know that death is not the end of things. And so Abraham mourns, he weeps over his wife, but then he plans. Look at verse 3. And Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and a foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. And so Abraham gets up from Sarah's deathbed. He goes into the city. He goes to the Hittites. Now, the Hittites during this time were the most prominent people in Canaan. Okay, and he goes to them, and he makes an honest confession. He says to them, I'm a sojourner and a foreigner. In other words, Abraham says to them, hey guys, listen, I know I've been here about 62 years now. But the reality is this is not my home. This is not my place. I have no rights here. I have no rights to property. I have no rights to land. Abraham at this time would be a lot like an illegal immigrant in the land of Canaan. He has no rights. So he says to them, he says, my wife has died and I need a place to lay her to rest. Give me, or the better word is to sell me property. Sell me a place that I can lay her to rest. Now, the Hittites, they owe Abraham absolutely nothing. Okay, Abraham, as an illegal immigrant at this time, legally, the Hittites could have told him to get out, and he didn't deserve anything. But notice what they do. Look what they do. Verse 5, the Hittites answered Abraham, and bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold you from his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. Okay, so the Hittites, they look at Abraham. The Hittites, they were a pagan people. They didn't believe in God, but they knew Abraham was a believer. They knew what he was about. And they look at Abraham, and they call him two things. The first thing they do is they call him Lord. Okay, this just simply means that they recognize that Abraham was a wealthy and successful man. If they stop there, that would be one thing. But they go on and they call him the Prince of God, or a Prince of God. In other words, they look at Abraham's life and they say, not only are you successful and wealthy, but we notice that you have been blessed by your God. We notice an intimate, personal relationship between you and the God that you serve. And because so, we want to offer you the choicest of tombs. Take any pick of any of our tombs, and you can have a tomb if you want a tomb. In other words, the Hittites, they extend to Abraham civilian rights. Hey, you're not from here, we recognize that, but we respect you. We notice that there's something special about your life. See, Abraham's had such a reputation with these pagan neighbors that they respect him. They notice God's blessing on his life, and they see that intimate connection between Abraham and God. Abraham has such a faith that even in the midst of the death of his wife, the Hittites notice something different. They say, hey, you're not mourning the same way we mourn when our wives pass away. Why is that? Abraham, we notice that even though your wife has passed, that for some reason you still have hope. Why is that? I think this confronts us with a very personal question. Would people outside of our church family look at us at maybe even in the most painful season of our life and notice a difference? People in your community, your work, or maybe even your house, would they notice God's blessing on your life? Would they notice that intimate, personal relationship between you and God? Do they see a difference of how you treat your spouse, both in life and in death? See, the Hittites noticed this about Abraham, and so they offer him this tomb. But we read this in verse 7. Abraham rose, and he bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land. Okay, so this was an image of Abraham saying, thank you for respecting me, thank you for offering me this. But the fact that he rose and then he bowed down essentially was saying to them, thank you, but no thanks. He said to them in verse 8, if you are willing that I should bury my dead out of sight, hear me and entreat me for Ephron, the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave at Machpelah, which he owns. It is at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence as property for a burying place. So here's what's going on. Abraham declines their offer of a free tomb because he knows a couple things. First, he knows that a single tomb is not a good tomb. Why? As a married man, why would it not be good for him to just receive a single tomb? Right? He wants to be buried with his wife. You know why? Because he believes in the resurrection. And when he is resurrected, you know who he wants to see? His wife Sarah. See, Abraham wants to be buried with his wife, so he knows a single tomb won't work. The second reason he knows this won't work is because in this time, property was not guaranteed. In other words, since he would not own the tomb, but somebody else would own it, it could be the nicest grave in the lot. But if they wanted that tomb, they would take Sarah out and put her who knows where. Essentially, Abraham is wanting to honor his wife by buying a piece of property, and he has one in mind, of having a place that he could go and visit her, a place he could go and honor her, a place of their own. I mean, can you imagine that, though? Can you imagine going, you bury your spouse, and you go to visit only to find that somebody else is there? That would be heartbreaking. And so Abraham counters the offer. He knows this nice piece of property. It's a cave large enough for an entire family. And it's owned by a guy named Ephron. And he wants to purchase this property, he says, for the full price. But here we read this in verse 10. Now Ephron was sitting among the Hittites. All right, where's Ephron at? Where's Ephron at? He's right there. Okay? So get this image, all right? Abraham is sitting at the gate. You remember what the gate is? It's an important place where business is done. Okay, so he's sitting at the gate. The Hittites are there, and Ephron is over to the side. Okay, so Abraham's like, I hope Ephron will give me his property, right? So he's saying this in front of him, trying to entreat him, trying to entice him. And we read this in verse 10, that Ephron was sitting among the Hittites. All right, I imagine kind of creepy. All right, Ephron, that's kind of a weird name, right? And Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in hearing of the Hittites. I watch way too many cartoons, okay? So Ephron, all right, you guys aren't tracking with me. So Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites, of all who went at the gate of his city. And he said this, No, my Lord, hear me. I give you the field. Did you notice that? I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. In the sight of the sons of my people, I give it to you. Bury your dead. So he says to him, I'll give you the cave, but not only the cave, I'll give you the field that the cave is in. That sounds like a pretty good deal, right? Except the fact that the word give here means the word sell. It doesn't mean give for free. He's not being so generous here as he is taking advantage of Abraham's situation. All right, so Ephron the Hittite, he looks at Abraham. He knows that Abraham is rich because he calls him what? My Lord. All right? My sugar daddy, right? This dude's got money. I know he has money. My Lord. I'm about to sell you something. My Lord. He knows that he's rich. What else does he know? That his wife has passed away. That he's in mourning and weeping. He knows that this man wants to bury his wife right away. And he knows that he wants his property. So do you know what Ephron does? He takes advantage of Abraham's situation. Ephron says, you want the grave plot? You have to buy the whole cemetery. Now Abraham bowed down before the people of the land. And he said to Ephron in hearing of the people of the land, but if you will hear me, I give the price of the field. Accept it from me that I may bury my dead here. It's a long way of Abraham saying, how much? How much? I'll pay it. How much is it? Ephron answered Abraham and said, my Lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead. All right, so how much does the cave and the field cost? How much does he charge him to honor his wife? 400 shekels of silver. All right, now, it's kind of hard on us, right? Does anyone have a shekel of silver? Anyone got that right now? Marlon's digging in his pocket. You got that? Yeah, you got one. Yeah, I just spent it, right? Yeah. So one shekel of silver, it's kind of lost on us in time because we don't use that. We have U.S. currency. We have our own currency. All right. Can you guess how many years it would take for a common person, okay, annual salary, to earn 400 shekels? If you had to take a stab, how long it would take, let's say you and I got a normal job in Canaan, all right, we're earning some money, how long would it take you to earn 400 shekels if you saved it all? 40 years. 40 years. Now, I don't know what your annual salary is or if you have an annual salary, but can you imagine if it cost you 40 years of your annual salary to bury your spouse? By the way, you know how much 400 shekels of silver weighs? 7 pounds. 7 pounds of silver given for this cave. Now, obviously, Ephron is taking advantage of it. Now, do you remember what Abraham is like, though? Abraham's a haggler, all right? So we kind of expect this. We expect that Abraham would maybe haggle a little bit, but look what he does in verse 16. Abraham listened to Ephron. Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weights current among the merchants. So the field of Ephron in Machpelah, which was to the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field throughout its whole area, was made over to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites before all who went to the gate of the city. So we kind of expect that Abraham would maybe counteroffer again, because you remember the situation in Sodom and Gomorrah? I mean, Abraham was willing to haggle with God. But what we see here, when it comes to his wife, listen to this, when it comes to his wife, Abraham isn't cheap. When it comes to honoring his wife, he doesn't skip. He loves his wife. He desires to honor her. And so when it comes to the honor of his wife, it is priceless. Men, I'm going to say it. And ladies, you can thank me later. Men, stop being cheap with your wife. All right, Garrett's got my back, all right? No one's coming to the men's barbecue today, all right? You're like, I'll show you, all right? Man, I don't mean financially. I mean emotionally. I mean physically. I mean spiritually. Don't be cheap with your wife. Don't skip out on her. Ladies, if your husband did not bring you to church today, go home and tell him, stop being so cheap. Get your butt up and go to church. Man, let's look to Abraham. I'll never forget this. So I shared with you guys last week that, or 2 weeks ago. My dad is Polish, and he's the best haggler I know. I shared with you, my dad went to H.H. Gregg, which is it's a store, a retail store, and convinced them to sell him a 50-inch TV for half the price. And after he got them down to half the price, he pulled out a coupon. And they were blindsided by it, and he said, hey, you got to honor this, and they did. He learned it from my grandfather, my great-grandfather, Joe, who went to Dodge, I believe it was Dodge, told them, I want to buy that truck, and they came back with a price, and my grandpa said no, and got this truck all the way down to, I don't know, let's just say $12,000. And they're like, okay, we'll give it to you for $12,000. And they added all the taxes and other things, and they brought the bill to my grandpa, and my grandpa said, you said $12,000. This is not $12,000. Go back until you make it $12,000. And they did. I mean, he was like, I don't know. He was good. Anyway, so I go to buy, the time comes, I'm going to propose to Faith, and I go to buy the ring, okay? And we walk into Albert's, and by the way, I got a T-shirt every time I went in there. I got my ring worth of T-shirts and that. So we go into this place, right? And I find the ring. I'm pulling every negotiation tactic I have, and it was Albert's the son. I don't remember his name, but I'm dealing with him, and I'm getting the price down. And it's just that I don't have enough money, and so I'm like, I'm gonna call my dad over. So my dad comes with me, okay, and we're negotiating. We're in the middle of this thing. Okay, and I'm pulling out my pops to help me out here. And my dad looks at me, and he goes, pay full price. I about had a heart attack. I thought my dad was demon-possessed. I thought something happened to my father. You ever see that movie, what's it called? Never mind. Where they switch faces? I thought somebody took my dad's face, and this was a totally different person, but my dad said, he said, pay full price, because some things are not worth haggling. Some things are worth it. Some things you do so much for the sake of getting the best deal or getting away with it. Don't be cheap, he told me. Abraham doesn't skimp when it comes to his wife. Abraham pays full price, and Ephron cheats him out of this. He throws in the field, and Abraham's, whatever, throw in the city, I'll buy it all. Now, there's a little hint there. Because what is Abraham thinking? I'm going to own this anyway. I'm just waiting on God to sign the papers, right? So Abraham is a man of faith, but he listens. He listens to Ephron. He pays full price. And he purchases the field. And here we come in the last two verses. We come to the very first funeral in the book of Genesis. After this, verse 19, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field at Machpelah, east of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as property for the burying place by the Hittites. Now that's repeated twice. Do you know why that's repeated twice? Because God wants there to be no mistake of who owns this property. Remember, for 62 years, Abraham has in faith been waiting for God to give him this promise, to give him the entire land of Canaan. And now what we see in Genesis 23 is it took the death of his wife to purchase him a small portion of God's promised land. Tracking with me here? Do you see Jesus in this? It took the death of Sarah to purchase Abraham a small portion of the promised land that God promised him. For us who are believers in Jesus Christ, it took the death of Jesus Christ to purchase our reconciliation, our home with God, in God's presence forever, away from sin, away from death, in endless, eternal joy and bliss in the presence of Jesus Christ forever. How can we not see Jesus in this? For those of you who are not believers in Jesus Christ, you are wandering around in your sin and in your shame, and you do not have an inheritance, a promise that God has promised you. You see, all of us are deserving of God's wrath and judgment. All of us have sinned against a holy, perfect God. We've earned our place away from God. But God sent his son Jesus to die on the cross for our sin, to pay for our sin. It was through his death that Jesus purchased our place in God's presence. And that if we put our faith and trust in God, he gives us a new home with him. That we don't have to wander around anymore. We don't have to fear death when our time comes. We could have confidence before God that we're forgiven, we're loved because of what Jesus has done in our place. Hebrews chapter 11, it mentions this. It says in verse 13 of Hebrews chapter 11, it says, "These all died in faith, not having received the things promised." In other words, Sarah died before God actually gave her the promised land. "But having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth." Verse 14, "For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. And if they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had the opportunity to return." In other words, they could have backed out in unbelief. Verse 16, "But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly home. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city." You and I, because of our sin, are looking and longing for something bigger and better than ourselves. And the thing that we are looking for is God himself. Not wealth, not property, but a place with God forever. So let's let Sarah's life of faith remind us that no matter how difficult things get in this life, maybe you're facing a death sentence, that no matter how difficult things are in this life, when you have God, you have everything that you need. Let's think about the price that Jesus paid on our behalf. He didn't have to do that. Jesus could have stayed in the glory of heaven, stayed being praised forever, and it would have been completely fair and fine. But Jesus, as the beautiful Savior that he is, chose to leave heaven to come to earth, to sympathize with us in our weakness, to put on flesh himself, to experience death himself. But he rose from the dead, showing that God accepted his payment on our behalf, demonstrating for us that though we may die in our physical flesh, that one day we too will be resurrected with him for an eternal life forever. So let me ask you, there's no question of will you die? We will die. But when that day comes, will you die in faith in Jesus Christ or in unbelief? We're going to move into a time of response. This passage, it just brought up so much. Death and life. Marriage and regret. Faith and unbelief. Honor and sacrifice. How can we read a passage like this and not be changed by it? How can we not look at our life and inspect the areas where we're not fulfilling the call that God has called us to? Is your faith in Jesus Christ? Or are you trusting yourself? Are you trusting your success? Are you trusting your wealth? Are you trusting other people? How long will you wander and be disappointed? I can tell you what you're looking for is Jesus Christ. And if you put your faith and trust in him, God will give you a new home with a new family. You'll have a new joy. You'll have a new life. Something to enjoy. Something that will change everything. There are people in this room who have been changed by it. Some of you in this room, man, maybe there are some things in your marriage or in your relationships that if you lost that person, you would have some serious regret. I would encourage you to use this time to first maybe confess your sin to God and confess your sin to your spouse. Maybe take it as an opportunity to tell your spouse how much you appreciate who they are, what they do. But I want you to be gripped with that reality that none of us are guaranteed, not even tomorrow, but today. Let's stop wasting time. Let's stop wasting our lives on petty things. Let's put our faith in Jesus. Let's die as people in faith. Let's die confident in Jesus Christ, knowing that he'll give us a new life, a new home. Let's move into a time of prayer, and when you're ready to stand and to sing, do that. Man, I'm gonna encourage you, if you need to step out and pray with somebody else, or maybe you need to pray with your spouse, maybe you guys just need to get away and talk, that's fine. Do what you need to do in this moment, but don't waste this time. Don't waste this work. I'm going to be standing in the back. I'd love to pray with you. If you have not trusted Jesus Christ as your Savior, it's never too late. You're never too far. He loves you. He died for you, and he wants you. He wants you. The question is, do you want him? Do you want him more than you want anything else? I'd love to pray with you. I'd love to talk to you. However God is calling you to move, I pray you do so.